program, All in the Mind, where she interviewed neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists about research on sleep, dreams, memory, creativity, and mind-body connections. Lynne is a graduate from the University of Sydney, majoring in psychology, education, and anthropology, and has a graduate diploma in communications from the University of Technology in Sydney. In 2014, she was awarded the Mental Health Matters Media Award for her contribution to mental health awareness on All in the Mind. Her book, All in the Mind, will be available for sale following our meeting. And I'm sure Lynne will be happy to autograph a copy of the book if you wish to purchase a copy. Please welcome Lynne.
Great. Hello, thanks so much for coming along. It's very good to see you all here. I'll start by briefly introducing myself so that you have an understanding of what inspired me to write the book after I had spent that almost 10 years doing the podcast All in the Mind and radio program. My interest and fascination in people, their behaviour and the workings of the human mind, more formally psychology and neuroscience, began quite early in my life. As a primary school child, I had anxiety issues. I worried about people who appeared to be less fortunate than I was, and I had other free-floating fears about the future. At times, this anxiety became overwhelming, so that I couldn't face going to school and putting myself out in the world. It naturally worried my mother so much that she took me off to a psychological counsellor. This was unusual in the mid-60s in a New South Wales suburban town. I only had a few sessions, but the experience fascinated me. I was asked to draw pictures and to tell her about my dreams, and I have actually been a very vivid dreamer all my life. And all this was so interesting to me. Mind you, I'm not sure that it solved my anxiety issues at the time, but it fueled my interest in the human mind and mental health and set me on the path I explore to this day. I studied to gain a psychology degree in university, intending to be a psychologist. However, that didn't happen and I pursued other things and travelled the world. I then, almost serendipitously, landed myself a job in radio production at the ABC. Moving through various areas, I joined the ABC Science Unit and discovered science communication and journalism suited me down to the ground. Being equipped with a combination of characteristics from a very logical and science-minded father and a lively, sharp-minded mother who was entertaining and an engaging storyteller. After years working in science journalism and broadcasting and leading the science unit of ABC Radio National, I was given the opportunity to host and produce the weekly radio program and podcast, All in the Mind. I did this with relish for just short of a decade until the end of 2020. It was difficult for me to let go of this role because it had been my dream job, although the decision was right for me at the time. Leaving it, though, caused me to reflect on what an amazing wealth of knowledge I had gained through the in-depth conversations with researchers, medical professionals, and the numerous people who openly shared their lived experience. This was my motivation. I decided to draw on these valuable conversations and related research to share my insights with readers. One of my priorities when I set out to write the book was to ensure that I not only included the vast range of science and research I had explored, but also the rich personal stories that have so generously been shared with me, as this, I believe, is the best way to engage readers and provide them with ideas from other people they can relate to and hopefully develop effective coping management strategies for their own lives. So out of the vast range of inspiring and transformative stories from the forefront of brain science, I have witnessed and explored. How do I start? What do I choose to include? It was a bit like my version of Sophie's Choice, but I was led by my gut feeling or intuition. I stood back and recalled the personal and research-driven stories which left a lasting impression on me. I also wanted to provide readers with my insights across a broad range of aspects of the brain and the mind, from the fascinating field of neuroscience, how the brain works, mental health issues and disorders, through to the nature and power of human connection. So I've divided the book into 4 parts: new insights into how the brain and mind work, living with mental difference, debilitating mental conditions, and new pathways to healing. Today I'll share with you just a taste of some of these sections. I want to start with the concept of neuroplasticity, or the relatively new scientific understanding that the brain can change in relation to our environment and potentially heal itself. You will be familiar with the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together. It's now understood that the development of brain cells or neurons don't stop at birth. The brain has the ability to establish new connections, reorganise pathways, and even create new neurons throughout life. This neuroplasticity is relevant to so many different aspects of the brain and the mind now, and though it does not always provide a silver bullet, furthering our understanding of it holds a world of hope for recovery and healing in the future. Take the story of Clark Elliott. He's a specialist in AI who had a traumatic concussion injury after a car accident. Disconcerting things started to happen to him. He felt like he was a zombie. He had trouble getting out of the chair, he couldn't tie his shoelaces. He looked the same on the outside, but inside it was as if his real self had left his brain and had become a ghost outside his body. Being an AI scientist, he was determined to get to the bottom of this. Having read up on neuroplasticity, he met 2 brilliant researchers who worked together with him to heal his brain. One was a cognitive psychologist who set him a complex regime of puzzles to practice. The other was an optometrist who designed optical glasses which trained his brain to establish new pathways. He made a remarkable recovery and finally felt like the ghost outside of him re-entered him and he found himself again. Clark's story is one example of how increasing our knowledge of neuroplasticity can open the way for exciting developments. Consciousness. People often wonder what the difference is between the brain and the mind-body problem, or the relationship between the physical and the mental, is one of the oldest dilemmas there is. The brain is the physical organ, the squishy cauliflower structure made up of grey matter and white matter. It has 4 lobes, all associated with specific functions, and the brain sends and receives chemical and electrical signals throughout the body. With developments in neuroscience and brain scanning technology, we are learning more and more about what areas are responsible for what. The mind is not material, it's invisible. It's each individual's unique experience. How do we know that what I might experience as a beautiful scene is the same as you experience if you were standing next to me? We probably never will know that, but the mind and the brain are intimately connected. It's largely agreed that the mind depends on the brain, but it's uncertain how. And this brings us to the biggest mystery ever: consciousness. How does the physical matter determine our unique experience? What exactly is consciousness, and how do we recognise it? And what if we fail to recognise it? Let me tell you the incredible story of a young man called Martin Pistorius, who I spoke to via Skype from the UK using computer-generated voice technology. At the age of 12, Martin fell into a coma because of a mysterious neurological illness. Unable to move or communicate, he was cared for in a residential home, and it was assumed that he was not conscious. He woke up years later at the age of 16, but no one knew. He was in his private nightmare, with what's called locked-in syndrome. He remained that way for 10 years or so, aware of everything that was going on around him. Until one day, a nurse discovered she could communicate with him by tuning into Martin's eye movements. This led him to eventually be able to communicate with computer-generated voice technology. He described to me his terrifying ordeal. In our interview, the quality of computer-assisted voice reminded me of the recordings you may have heard of the late physicist Stephen Hawking, where there was considerable delay between me asking the question and his response. But despite this, our conversation was warm and authentic. He told me all the imaginative coping mechanisms he used to keep himself sane, and some of the things he experienced and witnessed were awful and should not have happened to anyone. But no one realised he was conscious. Amazingly, while he was still in residential care and then able to communicate, he met a young woman called Joanna, who was visiting another resident. They fell in love and married, and now have a son. Martin eventually wrote a book to tell his frightening tale. Imagine what a difference it could have made if Martin's consciousness could have been detected years before. This thought led me to the amazing research, which I describe in the book, of the British neuroscientist Adrian Owen, exploring consciousness detection. It was quite fascinating. Memory. Memory is as elusive and difficult to define as consciousness, and the way we have conceptualised it over time has changed dramatically. We know that memory is very closely connected with emotions, and there are valuable lessons to be learnt about memory through telling stories to children. The memory code used by Indigenous cultures, like the Sangline system, holds some amazing power. And of course, we know that memory does naturally change with age. We are only too aware of the memory loss diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias, which many families have had to face, mine included. And though we don't have the solution to preventing and treating dementia yet, we are learning so much about better ways of living with dementia and the potential of lifestyle changes which could help in prevention. But we don't often hear about those with incredibly good memory. I want to tell you the story of Rebecca Sharrock, whose research into her amazing memory ability could well hold important knowledge to apply to memory loss in the future. Rebecca is a young Australian woman with a highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. She is one of approximately 60 people in the world with HSAM, and the only one in Australia. She recalls every day of her life. She told me one of her first memories was when she was just 12 days old. She was lying in the sheepskin cover of the driver's seat in her parents' car. Her parents were taking a photo of her, and she told me she was looking at the steering wheel and the camera and wondering what they were. She has some earlier recollections too. She doesn't recall leaving the womb, but remembers being in a bed on a blanket with glass walls all around her. It was probably a humidity crib. In our interview, I gave her some random dates from her past to see what she remembered. The first was the 4th of September 2006. She quickly replied it was a Monday, and she and her mum were on the way to the doctor when her father called with news that the Australian conservationist Steve Irwin had died after being stung by a stingray. She was devastated because she admired him so much. In response to another date I gave her, 24th of June 2010, she responded that it was a Thursday and they'd received the news about an oil spill in America and volcanic eruptions in Iceland. I was even more astounded by this next example. I knew she was a big Harry Potter fan, and I read out 3 random sentence beginnings from the book series, and you know how long that is. To which she immediately followed with the next sentences, along with the book number and the chapter number, not hesitation. We talked about whether this incredible memory was a gift or a curse. occurs in some way, she said. For example, when she remembered the time when she fell over and grazed her knee at the age of 3, she recalled the pain and the trauma of that with the intensity of that a child experiences an accident like this, as if it was yesterday. She also described sometimes being stressed and having trouble sleeping because she has so many thoughts and memories from her whole life constantly revolving around in her head. However, she's very happy to be contributing to the research of HSAM because the scientists are finding some clues from what happens in the brain with this superior memory ability to solve some of the questions being investigated about how to treat and prevent loss of memory and dementias. And she has written a book in the last couple of years, and you guessed it, it's an autobiography. Imagine that editing job. I'm still in touch with her, and she has completed a documentary with her family about life with highly superior memory. I'll be looking out for that one. Something I feel very passionate about, having explored the inner experience of so many people while making the All in the Mind podcast and writing the book, is the importance of valuing the diversity of human experience. And the more we learn about people's different realities, the more we can understand, accept, and support each other. The term neurodiversity is challenging our notions of what's mentally normal. It's a revolutionary cultural movement grounded in the idea that we are born different, whether we fit into what's naturally being considered normal or not. Each person is unique in their way of being and perceiving the world, and that uniqueness is something to celebrate. Our understanding of autism spectrum disorder is a good example of this and has grown hugely in recent years, though it remains somewhat controversial. My meeting with John Elder Robeson, autistic advocate and author from the United States, deeply moved me. He's now in his 60s and describes himself as the unwanted child. No one would play with him. He was referred to as the weird guy who was bullied. This was very painful and isolating. He failed his school grades and became very angry and left school to join a rock and roll band as a sound engineer. He told me he didn't appreciate the music as others did, but the beauty for him was in the technical side, fixing the machines and technology and getting the sound quality just right. He became known as Ampy, and in the mid-1970s he worked with rock bands like Pink Floyd and Kiss. John was the guy who made Kiss band member Ace Frehley's guitar smoke. I don't know whether you remember that one. It was a bit of electronic mastery he's very proud of. John was 40 before he realised he was on the autism spectrum. He told me that his diagnosis was liberating for him because for the first time in his life, he had a non-judgmental explanation for his difference, that he wasn't stupid or defective. From that time, he began to learn about how he could change his personal interactions and communication skills to improve the understanding between him and others not on the autism spectrum. He's now a strong autism awareness advocate. A moment that sticks in my mind with my conversation with John was when he told me about some brain stimulation he'd had. He was invited to participate in an experiment to see what effect transcranial magnetic brain stimulation would have on his ability to read other people's emotions. In another part of the book, I talk about the use of TMS for treating depression. He didn't notice much change just after the treatment, but he described to me what happened in the car on his way from one of his early sessions. He turned on his iPod because he would often listen to music tracks he had worked on in the 70s to admire his own technical expertise. Tears filled his eyes as he described to me the flood of feelings he experienced. He said he felt all the emotion of the music that he never had before. He said it was overwhelming, just like magic. He fed back to the brain stimulation researchers by saying, "Boy, that's some powerful mojo you've got in that machine." There's a lot more research to be done in the effectiveness of this therapy for autism, but it's interesting hearing about the impact it had for John. There is a wide range of different ways of being and perceiving, and to understand and learn more about these further equips us with ways to support people who are challenged by difference, as well as increasing the level of empathy and compassion in society. I explore the research and experience of those who have synesthesia, which is a way of perceiving, often described as a mixing of the senses. There are a number of different types, and some of you may well experience this yourself. I tell about one amazing young girl, Eliza, for whom different sounds create specific visual images, and letters and numbers evoke colours, and even particular people have colour. For example, she told me that for her, I was a mixture of yellow and orange. It was fascinating to hear her describe the shapes and colours she perceives when she's playing music on the saxophone. For many people, their synesthesia feeds their creativity in music and art. Another type is called mirror touch synesthesia. People with this type experience the pain and emotions of others as if it was happening in their own body. This is a great interest in neuroscientists because it's believed to be an extreme form of the basic human trait of empathy. I write about a doctor who has mirror touch synesthesia. What a choice of career that is for him. Although it's very challenging for him, he believes that it also makes him a better doctor because his empathy level is very high. Prosopagnosia, or face blindness, is a condition where people are unable to recognise or distinguish human faces. I write about my conversation with Dr. Karl Krushenicki of ABC fame and challenged him on why, after 20 years of working with him, he's just learnt to recognise me using cues other than my face. Investigating the condition of prosopagnosia is giving researchers more clues about face processing and how natural selection has endowed us with a highly specialised brain mechanism to carry out a very specific and important evolutionary task. These are just a few examples of different ways of perceiving the world. I now want to tell you the stories of two women I write about in my book who I greatly admire for what they have endured in their lives and how they've made their journeys of recovery. Their stories appear in the section of New Insights into Debilitating Mental Conditions. Back in my uni days while studying psychology, I was captivated by the movie called Sybil, which starred Sally Field. It was set in the 1950s and it told of a graduate student who developed what was known then as multiple personality disorder. The film depicted how she developed numerous personalities as a way of coping with a very traumatic childhood and the psychological therapy that ensued. Later I learned that this story was an elaborate hoax, but the disorder itself is real and it's now called Dissociative Identity Disorder, or DID. So when I had the opportunity to speak to Kalina Kuchers, who had recovered from dissociative identity disorder after years of intensive therapy, I leapt at it. I really didn't know what to expect, but she immediately struck me as warm, authentic and grounded. She told me of the hundreds of alters, or what she preferred to call hearts, that she lived with. They all had their own different traits. Some loved sport, some were clumsy, some wore glasses, some spoke different languages, some others were shy, fun-loving, angry, nervous, confident. Too numerous to describe them all. These parts came out for her as a complex protective mechanism, a system which her brain had developed to shield her from the extreme trauma and abuse she had experienced at the hands of her father during her childhood. She only realised that she had DID when her own young children were at the age that she had experienced abuse herself. She felt depressed, anxious, and sought help. That's when she was diagnosed and began years of very clever therapy. She now feels fully integrated, but interestingly says that sometimes she misses her parts, which combined into her whole self-identity for so long. A few years later, you can imagine my interest when a book landed on my desk called Hope Street, a memoir of multiple personalities, creating selves to survive. Rhonda Mackin's story of violent rape and abuse at the hands of her father from the time she was just a few years old was shocking, and I wondered, could it be real? Her book described her horrific experiences and the intricate, complex pattern of hundreds of alters that had developed, again, to protect her from facing the reality of abuse. When she first arrived for our interview, she wanted to know one thing before we started. Did I think she was mad? This took me back. But when I was able to reassure her by telling her that I had some understanding of DID from my previous research and interview with Kalina, so no, I did not think she was mad. Rhonda was very vulnerable in the interview as she described the complexity of the hundreds of characters she had created in her mind to help her dissociate from her extreme trauma. After the interview, as we were saying goodbye, she had one last request. Could you give me a hug to thank me for listening and believing her? I was deeply moved, further realising how many others live with challenging inner experience silently, often suffering a good deal of shame and stigma. But I was also struck by the extraordinary way that the human brain is able to create such a highly effective protection mechanism to allow people who experienced extreme trauma to cope with daily living until eventually they can receive treatment and help they need to heal. Before I finish, I'd like to share a couple of stories I have written about in the final section of my book, which features new pathways to healing. I've been greatly inspired by how our growing knowledge of the brain and the mind is contributing to new and natural approaches, which offer a great deal of hope in the future. In this section, I write about alternative approaches to treatment of mental illness, how we can better support and improve the lives of people living with dementia, and how the increasing research and insight into the connection between the body and the mind opens the way for new and exciting treatments. One of the areas, though, that you may find interesting is the music in your brain. And having listened to Elizabeth, it's particularly poignant. Music has always been a central part of my emotional life, as it has for most of us across all cultures. It's been shown through brain scanning studies that whether we're listening, playing or composing, the stimulus of music activates more areas of the brain than anything else we know about. We would all be aware of the close connection between music and our memory. Just hearing a snippet of our favourite music from our teenage years, for example, can bring back so many memories and sensations from those days and even reconnect us with our sense of identity, who we are. One moving experience I had was when I visited an aged care residence where they were trialling a music and memory program. It involved preparing a playlist of some of the residents' favourite music from their younger days, which was informed by relatives. I met a man called John, who was visiting his wife, who was in the very late stages of dementia, and she was largely unresponsive and had lost the power of speech. They both put on earphones and one of their favourite songs from their courting days was played to them. It was Close to You by the Carpenters. A couple of the staff and I watched on as tears streamed down the faces of both John and his wife, who had clearly been transported back to those precious early memories. Of course, this caused tears to run down the faces of me and the staff as well. It was so moving. And just this little example demonstrates the potential of music to enrich the lives and memories of many. Another example about the powerful healing of potential, the powerful potential of music is the story told to me by Andrew Schulman and his recovery from a coma through music. Andrew Schulman has been a professional guitarist for 3 decades when he had a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer and then became massively ill through complications after surgery. He went into a coma. Nothing was working. His wife came up with this idea to play him his favourite piece of music, Bach's St Matthew's Passion, which was on his iPod. Almost miraculously, the music brought him around to full consciousness and he recovered. Wow. He was so taken with the healing power of music that he became what he calls a medical musician or a medical muso, working in a hospital intensive care unit in the United States. He would move around the hospital beds playing the guitar to patients and was overcome by how helpful it seemed to be for them. Music is so powerful. I've come away with a great deal of hope from my experiences. There are new treatments and pathways to healing being researched constantly, and combining neuroscience with psychology and personal lived experience is the key to more hope in the future. I want to emphasise how privileged I've been to speak with so many amazing academics, researchers, medical professions, and the many people who've openly and generously shared their lived experience of what makes us exquisitely human. I hope you enjoy the book, have a look at the book, and thanks so much for coming along and being as curious and interested in this field as I am.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. We'd like you to send me questions for the chair and be to the point, nice and short, no great long dialogue, and I'm sure you'll be happy to answer some questions. But it'll be only for a very short time, and after that time's up, we'll have the opportunity to speak to Lynne privately, probably before you go. Anyone got a question? Yeah. Can you give your name as well as...
I'm within the